everybody, welcome back to the next part in my Creating a Great Tone series for our Line 6 Helix. And I just wanted to say it's a sad day. We're going to say goodbye to an old friend of mine, which was the split crossover technique that has become quite popular since I did a video on it quite a ways back now. But actually, having said that, we're not going to totally get rid of it yet, and I'll explain as we go on. Some interesting stuff here. If anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about is, with the recently released 2.8 firmware update for our Helix, they finally added in some very special EQs. And they're really nothing special, but we haven't had the ability to use anything like this without the kind of split crossover workaround that I was just discussing. So what they've added in is an adjustable high and low shelf EQ and another type of EQ called a tilt EQ. Now I did a video a while back as sort of a little preview to what these are, and I used some plugins within my DAW to kind of illustrate what these would be like. But now that we have 2.8, I can actually show you what these plugins do. So just as a quick recap, what the split crossover technique was that I was doing, and let's just go over to HX Edit, it's easier to show you up on screen here. What was happening with that is because we didn't have a low or a high shelf EQ, I would go in and take two gain blocks per se, as we see here. I just ignore all of this. I'll go through the signal chain in a couple minutes when we're ready to actually do some audio examples. But what I would do is I would add two simple gain blocks, and I would go to the split block here, and I would change it to split crossover and set the frequency wherever I needed it to be. And what that would do is it would send all the frequencies above this set frequency to our top path here. Okay, so path 1A, and it would send all the frequencies below that down to path 1B. So what it allowed us to do is to be able to boost or cut all the frequencies above or below this, basically acting like a shelf EQ would, that we would use in our normal DAW plugins possibly, or even just right within our DAW's channel EQ. We also had the ability to reverse that, where it would send, all the frequencies below that up to path A1A, and all the frequencies above that to, path A. I'd never used that, but anyways, that's what it is. So if you take something like this preset here, where I have it set at 2 kilohertz as sort of the crossover point. I'm here boosting all the frequencies above that by 3 dB and all the frequencies below that by 3 dB. Okay, so that was a workaround really, because all that really was a shelf EQ. But it kind of gave the ability to almost create the same effect as moving a microphone around on a speaker, and that's how I described it way back when I first did a video about this and kind of introduced this whole little concept. Because that's what actually kind of more or less happens as we move our microphone to different parts of the speaker. We're going to get different frequencies kind of accentuated and some, not so much. So that's one way I kind of describe it. It's not exactly like that, but I thought that would be a good way to put it in layman's terms for those who aren't used to using EQs. Well, what do we have in the 2.8 update? Well, we have two things. We have a shelf EQ. So here's the first time we see what this looks like, okay? So I have a couple settings made here just because some tests I was running. But what we have here is the low frequency that we want to boost or cut all the frequencies from there and below. And we have the high frequency, which means we're going to boost or cut all the frequencies above that. So if you notice here, I have them both set at 2 kilohertz. Okay, more on that in a minute. And I've cut all the frequencies below 2 kilohertz by 3 decibels. And I've boosted all the frequencies above 2 kilohertz by 7 decibels. Okay, we also have a master level control if we need that. All right, now we also have something else though. And I'm really happy the Line 6 folks put this in. This is the tilt EQ, which is, if you go back to the video I did as a preview to this, I explained what it is. But basically, we pick a crossover point, much like I did in my little split block here. So I said 2 kilohertz. So over here, I'm going to pick a center frequency of 2 kilohertz. And then we can either make it brighter or darker here. Now I had this set at bright 80, I think. what that's going to do, and the reason they call it a tilt, is imagine our center point being here, and then we have our frequencies flat. Well, we can tilt them so the lows go down and the highs go up, or the lows go up and the highs go down. Okay, so that's why they're calling it darker or brighter. Obviously, if we're pulling lows out and boosting a bunch of high-end frequencies, then it's going to get brighter, and vice versa, right? So that's a really interesting feature as well. Now, we can set our center frequency from anywhere from 100 hertz all the way up to 5 kilohertz, which is going to be quite useful. I'll set this back 2 kilohertz where I had it. Now, before I go on and do any comparisons, there is one little complaint that I have, and I shouldn't say complaint. And I've already actually talked to the folks at Line 6 about this, and it seems like, I don't want to make any promises because it's not up to me, but it seems like it will be addressed in a future update. A lot of times when I would use my split crossover, I would set this more often than not around 650 hertz. I just like that as a crossover point to be able to boost all the frequencies above that. Now that's a little weird as far as a high shelf goes, because a high shelf is supposed to be able to boost or cut highs, right? High frequencies. 650 is more of a mid to low mid frequency, so it does make sense that they wouldn't necessarily go all the way down to the ability of using a high shelf at 650 hertz. But it is one of the things that I would really like to see. So what has happened here is Line 6 has made it so that the low frequency has a range of 20 hertz up to 2000 hertz. But the high frequency starts at 2000 hertz and goes all the way up to 15,000 hertz. That makes a lot of sense in the way they implemented it. It's just that that doesn't really allow me to do what I was doing with it a lot. Now, is it a deal breaker? No way. This is still a great tool to have, and it's going to be useful in the vast majority of situations. The interesting thing, and as a workaround, is the Tilt EQ, right? Does do this. So I could simply go to my favorite spot of 650 hertz and use that. Now, the only thing is, sometimes I would only boost the frequencies above without wanting to touch the ones below. So this, when I touch the ones above, it's going to pull out some of the lows. So maybe I just have to do a slightly less dramatic adjustment. So lots of flexibility here. I mean, there is the other side of it that I could, tilt it brighter and then use another block of the shelf EQ set for the lows to be brought back in. But then I'm using 2 blocks again. But there are workarounds, and it's not a deal breaker, as we're going to see. We're going to do some tests here and just sort of see how this sounds in comparison to the split crossover that I was doing. And I think it's pretty interesting stuff in what I messed around with briefly with it. So really interesting stuff. So I hope to see that in a future update, and I've been told it's very likely. I don't imagine that's a difficult thing. I don't have anything to do with how they code these things, but I don't imagine it would be a difficult thing to be able to move that frequency down. Okay, so let's see what we have here. I've set up 4 snapshots. I have kind of this normal template that I would use, a little bit of LA Studio Comp at the end. A low and high cut set at 100 hertz and 11 kilohertz respectively. A little tiny bit of room verb. As I showed you, I have my tilt EQ, I have my shelf EQ, and I have my split crossover set up. I simply just had a placator dirty amp set. This is just as the settings come up when you just open the model up. So I didn't even touch that. And I purposely put on a 412 greenback 25 with a 121 ribbon, and I didn't pull it back at all 1 inch. I wanted this to be dark. The placator has a fairly dark sound to it just when you pull it up. So if you throw something like a dark ribbon mic on it and don't pull it back at all, it's going to be very dark. But I did that on purpose. So we'll hear what the flat sound is like in a moment. And then what I did is I set up a snapshot where I bring in the crossover without the tilt or the shelf. Then the next one with shelf EQ is taking the split crossover out and just hearing the shelf EQ, high and low shelf, and then taking all of those out and just hearing the tilt, so that we can easily go back and forth between them and hear how they compare to one another, okay? So how I did this is by setting the crossover point on the split crossover at 2 kilohertz. The reason is that's all I could do, as I already explained, on the low and high shelf, right? So I set my high frequency to be able to boost or cut everything above 2 kilohertz and my low to boost or cut everything below 2 kilohertz. So it's kind of the same thing as having this center point at 2 kilohertz on the split crossover. And then what did I do on the tilt? The same thing, right? I set it at, I had it set at 2 kilohertz. I changed that to as an example before. So I have that set at 2 kilohertz as well. Now you might notice the different settings here. What I've done on my split crossover is I've taken all the frequencies above 2 kilohertz and boosted them 3 dB, all the frequencies below and brought them back 3 dB. Now, if you notice on the Shelf EQ, though, I have all the frequencies below pulled back 3 dB, but I have all the frequencies above boosted 7 dB. And then I have the level pulled back minus 1.3 to kind of get the volumes the same. And then I had the tilt EQ set at 2 kilohertz and much heavier to the bright side of things, as we can see here, set to bright 80. So that was going to really boost the frequencies above 2 kilohertz and really kind of cut the frequencies below. But because we can't see the slopes and the crossover, how these are actually dialed in, we don't really know what this is going to sound like until we listen. So let's do this. Let's listen to the flat sound, completely flat without any of the split crossover, the shelf, or the tilt EQs. You're going to hear how dark this is, and I think everybody will agree this is not a tone we would really want to use. Sounds very typical of a ribbon mic close-up on a cabinet. It's dark. There's something nice and creamy about it, but there's no real bite to it. It's lacking any presence, right? A little too dark and muddy. Okay, so let's do the next snapshot by bringing in the split crossover. Like I said, set at 2 kilohertz, boosting everything above by 3 dB and pulling everything below to minus 3 dB. And you're going to hear how that just opens this tone up. Big difference. Let's go back and forth between that. Just watch up here as I switch between the snapshots as I play. So here's the flat, and I'll go between that and the split crossover. What a difference, right? Just by bringing that split crossover in, it just opened the sound up and made it quite usable, right? And that's why I think that technique caught on so much and so many folks started using it, right? And really all it is applying a low and a high shelf to the sound. All right, well, let's go now to our Shelf EQ. I'm going to bring this back. Let's remember the setting I have on the high gain of plus 7 dB and the setting I have on the low level of minus 1.3. I'm going to zero that off, and I'm going to set this so that we see the settings are the same as my low and my split crossover blocks, okay? Both boosting and cutting minus 3 dB above and below. We'll listen to that, and then I'm going to go back and forth between the split crossover and that, and let's listen for any differences, okay? So here is the low and high shelf. Sounds not bad. Listen to the flat again. Shelf EQ. Now some folks might assume, well, that's doing exactly the same thing as a split crossover now. But we really don't know how dramatic the slopes are on these shelves, right? Is it going to be the same between the split crossover that we were using and this new low and high shelf EQ block? Well, we don't know. Well, let's listen now comparing the split crossover, and again, watch up here for the snapshot, crossover versus shelf EQ. I'm going to play the split crossover first and then switch to the shelf EQ. Listen close for that and watch on the screen when it switches. You guys hearing what I'm hearing? The split crossover actually makes it a little bit brighter, and it's a little bit darker with the Shelf EQ. So that's why when you saw this before, what I found I had to do is boost this up to about 7 dB. And again, I was just really going quickly by ear. Now that's going to have added some volume to it, so I pulled this master level back by 1.3 dB. Now let's listen to the comparison between the two. Here's a split crossover again, watch on screen, and I'll play back and forth between them. Could possibly be a little bit louder still. Let's do this. Maybe the 7 is a little much. Let's try 6. That's a lot closer. Again, I'm not saying it's exact. It doesn't have to be. It's not the point of this. But it just shows that to get the highs where we want them to be in comparison to split crossover, we may have to go a little bit more dramatic for whatever reason. I'm not going to get into depth into why that might be. But it's kind of an interesting little thing to notice. But the point is, we pretty much can get rid of the split crossover in most of those cases as long as our center frequency is going to be nowhere below 2 kilohertz. Now, the other side of this is we could also do some other cool things where we say, well, I don't want, and which we couldn't do with the split crossover. So this is the other added bonus. Let's say I just wanted to cut everything below, let's say, 450 hertz and boost everything above 2 kilohertz without touching any of the frequencies between 2 kilohertz and 450 hertz. What does that sound like? Well, here it is. Compare that to flat. Compare that to split crossover. So more flexible. So it's weird. In one way, it's not doing exactly what we wanted or not what we wanted, sorry, how I used it in the past for setting sort of the center frequency point lower than 2 kilohertz. But I think that's why they brought the Tilt EQ in, which we'll talk about in a second. But it does open up a lot of new possibilities in that we can set the low frequency maybe lower and the high frequency higher, right? Maybe we want the low gain down, you know, at 330 and the high gain up, only boosting everything above 5 kilohertz. So lots of flexibility, and like I said, really not a deal breaker in any way, and it's a wonderful, amazing addition to our Helix. Okay, well, what about the Tilt EQ? Well, because of the example that we're using here, I set my center frequency to 2 kilohertz, and I rocked it so that it was going to pull the frequencies below that out quite a bit and boost the frequencies above that quite a bit. Bright 8, now you might say, how did I get Bright 80? Well, let's listen to that in comparison to the split crossover. Okay, so here's our split crossover. What you'll notice is you get the high end kind of close, but the bottom goes away a bit because it's pulled so much low out. So maybe I'll pull this back to Bright 60, see how that compares. See, a little bit darker, right? Let's maybe go in the middle to about 70. $75. Very close, right? So with the tilt, you know, and then so what if I do this like I used to do at 650 hertz, right? And I don't know, maybe pull that to 50. Works quite nicely, and you're probably going to be able to get pretty darn close to what we had in the past. Okay, so let's compare all of these. Here's our flat again, and then watch on the screen and I'll go between split crossover, shelf EQ, and tilt EQ. Make sure I've set all the settings back to where we wanted them to be. All right, so here we go. Watch up on the screen. Here's flat again. What do you guys think? You can see there's going to be differences. It's not going to be exact, but really that's us comparing it to the split crossover, which wasn't really something I don't think it was ever designed to do. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know why, you know, maybe that was one of the reasons they put the split crossover in. Here's the other good news. Nobody's saying we have to stop using the split crossover, right? It does use up 2 blocks and it gets rid of our split path, right? So it'll, you know, if we wanted to maybe use a dual cab on split paths or something along those lines, or some parallel effects on that same path, then, you know, it gets rid of our ability to split that path. So that's the one drawback that a lot of folks had in something like the Stomp, right? It's going to take up a whole extra kind of block, right? Which now with the tilt or the low and high shelf, we can work around and not have to use it, which is a great feature. But I think the point is, with the tools that have been given to us now, if we're not just directly comparing them to the old split crossover, we're going to be able to get really close, you know, and then, you know, maybe using one of those, we go and dial our amp in a little bit different or whatever, or, you know, pull our microphone, or if it's a, you know, 121 room, maybe we're going to pull it back a little bit further, and then, you know, dial our tilt or our low and high shelf in a little differently. So I hope that explains that, all right, guys? If you have any questions, please leave them for me, but I'm really happy with it. I'm really excited, and I'll be totally thrilled and happy once we can go a little bit below the 2 kilohertz, hopefully down to around 500 hertz or something would be really, really cool. But even that, is it going to sound exactly like the split crossover because of the whole, you know, shelving slope and whatnot? Very likely it won't, but then we're splitting hairs, right? It's really just another tool to help us craft our tone, and I think it's perfectly fine the way it is, you know, So anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in. So happy that I was able to show everybody this. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I'll always like to answer those as time permits. And please like the video, share it if you don't mind, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. All right, thank you so much. I'll be back soon with some more content. Ciao for now, and thanks again for tuning in.